Greetings. Now, as part of my Inflation Victory Lap series, I'm going to do a retrospective assessment of a pair of videos that I made over 3 years ago, and it's an opportunity for an AI audio remastering of these videos as well. And these were from the YouTube channel Economics Explained, which has a large number of subscribers and teaches people about economics, except for the fact that what the narrator of this channel says about inflation is completely wrong and conceptually illogical. Plus, he said things like hyperinflation is already here and things of that nature, which is clearly something that was not true in 2021 and is not true now. In fact, inflation is collapsing now, which is why I'm doing a victory lap of why my estimation that inflation is not structurally high was proven to be correct. So I am going to combine these two videos in a retrospective review, which will make the total length of this video about 40 minutes long. But for those who want to see what I said at that time and whether I was right or Economics Explained was right is something you can see for yourself. So on to the content. Greetings. This is going to be a video that takes apart a very famous video from another channel. The channel is Economics Explained, as you can see me circling with my cursor here. And it has 1.21 million subscribers. And recently they did a video, well, in April, they did a video about how hyperinflation is already here. You just haven't realized it yet. And this video has over 2.3 million views. And needless to say, just about everything in this video is wrong. Now, the interesting thing about this channel is, from the point of view of a successful YouTube channel, this channel has achieved amazing success with very little effort. The channel creator just does his own voice narration over some stock video footage relevant to whatever he's talking about, and therefore the amount of subscribers he has relative to the low amount of effort is very impressive, and perhaps it is something that I should emulate once I figure out how to use similar stock footage and what the rights are and the pricing is for that, or if some parts of it is free. He doesn't even need a camera. He just has an audio recording over the stock footage. But that being said, the creator of this channel is someone who obviously has a formal economics degree and therefore does not actually know anything about major macroeconomic concepts. And one of the most egregious videos of that point is this one, where he insists that not only money printing causes hyperinflation, but that it is already here. Other people say that hyperinflation will happen, and they keep predicting it and it doesn't come, including Peter Schiff, who I talk about over here, and others on this channel, as longtime viewers are aware of. They say that hyperinflation will happen because of money printing, and then they don't have an explanation about why it doesn't happen. But the creator of this Economics Explained channel says it is already here, and then he cherry picks all sorts of anecdotally selected pieces of evidence that try to support his narrative of hyperinflation but don't really hold up water, and we're going to dismantle a lot of those points in this video over here. Because to say that hyperinflation is already here, and that too as of April of 2021, which itself was about 5 months ago, is absurd. And it tells us how these formally educated economists are so theoretical that they can only believe in a model that they memorized from their graduate school, and they just cannot process why their model isn't delivering the results that they have been taught to expect, and therefore they have to assert without evidence that there's already hyperinflation and come up with the weakest possible rationales for that. So there's so many mistakes in the analysis of this video that it's really going to be a lot of work to dismantle all of them, so I'm only going to dismantle the most egregious ones. And the length of this video is 20 minutes, so for me to include the entire video and deconstruction of my own would make my own video far too long, so I'm only going to do portions of it. Needless to say, you could watch the whole video if you want, and the timestamp of the Economics Explained video will be visible in the footage of it that I rebut, but you can choose to watch whatever portions of this that you want. So we go to the video and we start playing it.
Under the rule of the newly formed Weimar Republic, found itself under significant duress.
Okay, so he already goes back to a regime of a century ago and how they found hyperinflation. No recognition about how technology makes the economy different. A software-oriented economy is a knowledge-based economy, and how different the world economy might be from a century ago.
This reckless money creation, combined with equally reckless borrowing and the reduction accelerated by a trade embargo placed on the country by the United Nations. To combat this, the government turned on the money printers and made borrowing a lot easier. You might be able to guess what came next. Zimbabwe, 2007. A poorly thought out set of policies.
Again, an extremely poor country that has no high-tech component to its economy, does not have a major software-based portion of its economy or a lot of consumer technology consumption. So the notion that hyperinflation could happen in the advanced economy just because it happened in Zimbabwe is absurd. So we continue.
These saw a mass exodus of capital from the nation, driving down the exchange rate of their dollar. This made importing farming supplies like fertilizer and farm equipment very expensive, which in turn crippled the output of the nation. North Korea, 2009. Farming output was hit by sanctions and a court.
Again, he is choosing to use only the most dysfunctional, most low-tech, most impoverished countries in the world to say, hey, if money printing caused hyperinflation there, it certainly would cause it in an advanced software-heavy economy such as the United States or Japan or the European Union. This is already extremely poorly argued.
Money printing, hyperinflation. Venezuela 2016. Ongoing political instability combined with international sanctions gave the government no choice but to print money in an attempt to maintain generous living standards. This reckless money creation, combined with the massive reduction in output, hyperinflation. In all of these examples, which are just a selection from the last century, there are a few very noticeable common trends. Some kind of destabilizing event, be it a war or a natural disaster or a piece of policy that leads to a sharp decline in productive capacity, which is corrected with stimulus measures funded by the printing of money. Unfortunately, almost all of these examples result in some form of failed state. But hyperinflation is different. Almost no economies recover from this diagnosis without some type of massive regime change or the total abandonment of sovereign currency, neither of which are particularly appealing options. In an attempt to combat this massive drop in economic output, the US has printed more than a third of the active money supply in the economy today within the last 12 months. This money printing has combined with an increase in private sector borrowing and a drop in productive capacity.
Okay, I stop right there. Viewers of this channel know that the United States does only 25% of the total world money printing, so why single out the United States as the only example of massive money printing? And money printing is borderless. I repeat, money printing is borderless and has been going on long before coronavirus. It has been going on for 11 years. As you can see in this video over here, which is a monthly series that I do that keeps track of cumulative world money printing and why that does not cause inflation and what the actual correct amount of money printing should be to create the optimum balance. But we continue.
Due to the devastation brought about by the global pandemic. If this set of circumstances sounds familiar, don't worry, because apparently it's all going to be different for the United States. And maybe it is. Maybe the USA really is a special economy that is so large and influential that it doesn't play by the same rules as these historic cautionary tales.
Yeah, those historic cautionary tales were either the most impoverished or dysfunctional economies in the world, or an example from over a century ago. Japan is a much smaller economy than the United States. It has printed much more relative to the size of its economy than the United States. Japan has, in fact, printed 130% of its total GDP to date, whereas the United States has printed only 30% of its total GDP to date. So again, singling out the United States as an example is just completely wrong and a deliberate omission, in my opinion.
When does inflation actually start to become an unsolvable problem in the economy? Why do people think the USA is immune from the same consequences as all of these other examples? We base economic value on how much a currency is worth. So, when it comes to assessing the value of that currency itself, things tend to get a little bit weird. We do this all the time with different currencies, no problem at all. One American dollar is buying $1.31 Australian, 110 Japanese yen, and 85 euro cents.
Okay, the insertion of this point itself proves that the deliberate omission of the fact that the United States is only 25% of the world's money printing at the moment, and that Japan, the EU, and China are also printing roughly the same amount each as the United States, is, to me, a very gigantic omission that undermines the entire premise of this video. He's going to talk about exchange rates and then act as though only the U.S. is printing money and how the U.S. dollar is supposedly about to devalue greatly relative to all these other currencies, which has not happened in the last 30 years and certainly not in the last 11 years of money printing, because they're all printing money. So to effectively predict that the United States dollar is going to weaken tremendously relative to these other currencies demonstrates a substantial lack of knowledge from this narrator.
At a stretch, this exchange rate can also apply to other assets. $1 is buying 0.03 ounces of silver, 10 kilos of rice, or 1/60,000th of a Bitcoin. Of course, normally we express these exchange rates the other way around, but you can start to see that market value is almost always expressed as an equation of dollars to goods. I prefer to think of this abstract relationship in terms of goodness. If, for example, America falls into total chaos, which I know might be a hard reality to imagine, well, then the goodness of American dollars would fall. This would mean that Australian dollars would increase in relative value despite not necessarily being any more good themselves. 100 Australian dollars could still buy you the same amount of stuff that they did before America fell into chaos. It's just that now you can buy more American dollars with them. Now, moving on from this example that hits a little bit too close to home, let's consider another example. Imagine the relationship between the US dollar and the S&P 500 index. Again, we express this as an equation with one of the units of the index being worth approximately 400 American dollars at the time of making this video. Since the beginning of 2020, this index, which is made up of the 500 largest companies in America, has undoubtedly become less good. Sure, there are a few companies that have benefited from working from home or delivering products to combat the pandemic, but most companies are struggling. Global supply chains have been slowed, making production more difficult. People are moving about less, therefore burning less fuel.
Okay, many problems right here. People are moving about less and therefore burning less fuel. Therefore, the demand for fuel went down, and that is deflation, not hyperinflation, number one. Number two, notice this sleight of hand that tries to now say stock market gains are inflation. If the CPI inflation rate is 2% and the stock market rose 10%, then those who owned the stock market gained 8% net of inflation. Wealth was created. The notion that the rise in the stock market itself comprises inflation is absurd because they then have precluded any scenario under which wealth actually rises. In fact, if there's a technology entrepreneur who starts a company and the value of that company rises tremendously and the entrepreneur becomes a billionaire, according to this logic, that entrepreneur suffered a terrible thing. He suffered from a tremendous amount of personal hyperinflation, according to them. The poor person became a billionaire because of all the horrible hyperinflation that he experienced. Much more hyperinflation than other people, by the way. That is the twisted pretzel of logic that these economists tie themselves into, because they just cannot accept that the whole model that they spend years studying a worthless PhD in is just wrong and outdated. It may have been valid in the 1970s, but it's extremely invalid today. So we continue.
This is all to say nothing of companies directly involved in tourism or hospitality, which are now basically on government life support. It's fair to say that this collection of 500 companies is less good than it was 16 months ago. It's producing less, making less profits.
Completely false. It's making more profits than ever before, partly because of the money printing, and partly because of the low interest rates enable share buybacks that increase earnings per share. Now, part of my complaint about how money printing is done is that it is done in a way that benefits only the largest corporations and wealthiest individuals, or in other words, the entities and people that need it the least, whereas it doesn't help people at the bottom of the ladder, and therefore it would be much fairer to send cash directly to people, as you know. But now he's saying the earnings are less and people are consuming less. That would mean deflation, but he's trying to say that now deflation is in fact hyperinflation.
And is far more reliant on government subsidies that may or may not continue into the foreseeable future. It would therefore stand to reason that, all other things being equal, this index would be exchangeable for fewer American dollars today than it was back at the beginning of 2020s. But of course, that's not the case. In fact, it's actually exchangeable for 30% more dollars than it was at the beginning of 2020. So either this equation is totally illogical, or the true value of dollars has fallen faster than the true value of this collection of companies.
Okay, many problems with that. First of all, the S&P 500, while it contains U.S. corporations, at least 1/3 of the business of all those U.S. corporations is from overseas, number one. And number two, I go back to the principle of how the U.S. is only 25% of world money printing. When Japan, the European Union, and China also print money, that helps S&P 500 companies as well. So to single out America as somehow uniquely vulnerable to a collapse of its currency and hyperinflation, when in fact in relation to its GDP, it is doing less money printing than the other three big entities that I described, is absurd. And it is just memorized textbook level economic thought from economists who are just so theoretical that they just can't see the massive flaws in the decades outdated premises that they have built their assumptions on. So we continue.
Now, of course, we normally see an appreciating stock market as a good thing. But again, that's because we measure value from the perspective of dollars. If the stock market appreciates in value, we naturally assume it's because the companies in that market are doing better for their investors. We don't assume it's because our dollar-based frame of reference has fallen. Think of it another way. If the stock market and house prices and wages increase by 50% in a year, we would all think that's a really good thing. But if an average grocery trip became 50% more expensive in that same year, alarm bells would start ringing. Now,
notice how he went back to the hypothetical. If this occurred, then we would find it good. But if the inflation in groceries also occurred, we would find it bad. Except that the stock market has in fact risen a lot, and grocery prices have not risen by the same percentage at all. Therefore, wealth has increased, debunking the premise of hyperinflation. But we continue.
Of course, normally inflation is measured using one of these relationships between dollars and some kind of asset. But it's not any of the examples that we have seen thus far. Instead, it's a collection of goods and services called the Consumer Price Index. You can find a list of what's included in this index in your own country, and it does vary from country to country, broadly representing the spending habits of consumers in that nation. But here is the thing, it hasn't. Inflation has remained comfortably below 3% for this entire money printing ordeal.
Actually, it has remained below 2%, in fact, as I described in this video over here. But even if it were 3%, that is in fact an optimal level of inflation. It is not high inflation, and it is certainly not hyperinflation, which is what he says, but he just cannot explain this disconnect, whereas viewers of this channel know exactly why this is and why tremendous increases in prosperity are yet to come.
This becomes even more bizarre when you consider one other factor that contributes to the price tag of things, their component parts. Iron ore has more than doubled in price in the past 12 months.
Also false, because note that he made this video in April of 2021, so he cherry-picked a point 1 year before that, which was April of 2020. And as you can see from this video over here, where I talk about the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, that was the ultra-low cherry-pick point from a commodities price bust due to COVID. If you take the 10-year average of all commodity prices, it's actually deflationary, minus 2% a year, as you can see in that video that I just described.
Lumber, crops like corn and soybeans that make up a good portion of the food that we eat are up more than 70%. But the Consumer Price Index, an index of things that are made from steel and wood and corn and soybeans, has barely moved. So what is going on here? Is there some creative or potentially fraudulent accounting going on? Or is America really too good for inflation?
Okay, again, the premises are rather absurd here because all these commodity prices are priced globally. As we know, that Goldman Sachs Commodity Index is priced globally. And why fixate on America? America does only 25% of the world's printing, and it does less money printing in proportion to the size of its economy than Japan, the European Union, or China. So just factually wrong assumptions lead to increasingly contradictory statements being made in this video.
Oh, the two big forces to consider is that the US has made a lot more money while not making as much stuff. This means that there is naturally more money bidding for less stuff, which drives prices up.
Okay, another problem here. America makes a lot more software. He did not include software in his definition of stuff. That's why he assumes that all this money printing would bid up the price of the hard goods, but software prices don't increase from increased demand because they are completely dematerialized. If you sign up for a Netflix subscription, the price of a Netflix subscription doesn't rise because more consumers are signing up for it. If you download a piece of software that you pay for, the price of it doesn't rise if 1 million people want to download the same thing. And the complete non-recognition that there are value-added products that are not hard physical goods and that dematerialization is in fact a thing, which is why all the premises he has built up on top of his core central premise don't seem to hold water. So we continue.
Simple supply and demand. So far, these price hikes have been exclusively in asset markets like stocks, cryptocurrencies, real estate, and raw materials. But despite the direct relationship between these markets and the markets for consumer goods and services, the consumer price index that actually acts as the gauge for what we report as inflation has remained stubbornly low.
Wait, stubbornly low? That was kind of a Freudian slip, wasn't it? He knows money printing is going on. He believes that money printing causes hyperinflation because the entire economics profession believes that, and you cannot graduate with a degree in economics until you demonstrate that you believe that. Therefore, the CPI is not conforming with his model, so it is being stubbornly low, when in reality, in terms of uplifting the human condition and human prosperity, remaining low is a delightful thing. So we would say that it's remaining delightfully low while asset prices rise. And also note that earlier he said it's bidding up the price of stocks, once again including stock market rise as part of inflation, when in fact inflation should only be measured by commodities as well as things that consumers consume for their lives, not the increase in asset prices, because otherwise these economists are precluding any scenario under which wealth is ever actually created by saying that any stock market rise is hyperinflation.
Likely due simply to time. At the moment, people are still relatively apprehensive about spending too much money. The savings rate in the US is at its highest level in recent history, which means that demand for investment assets has risen at the expense of regular consumption. Now, this won't last forever. In many instances, this fiscal responsibility is not really even a matter of choice, and more so a matter of being stuck at home and unable to spend up.
Wait, so he said people are putting money in stocks rather than spending as consumers, but this will reverse. So when they start spending as consumers, there will be inflation in consumer goods, but they will have pulled out of the stock market, so the stock market would go down according to him. But since he called the stock market something that also contributes to inflation and is a component of inflation, the decline in stock market would mean an offsetter of consumer inflation, so there would still be no net inflation according to his logic. You see how contradictory all his beliefs are because they don't understand the first principles of technology and economics? It's really an incredibly intricate pretzel that these people twist themselves into.
In fact, in a lot of the examples we saw at the beginning of this video, hyperinflation started a year or two after the money printers were first switched on in earnest.
Again, he's using the Weimar Republic from a century ago because he can't find a good example that is more recent to the present. And he's again using gold as a metric of inflation. And gold prices have not moved much at all in years and years and years, as I speak about in this video over here. And all these people who say gold is a hedge for inflation never actually talk about why gold never performs the way that they want it to. And gold has been one of the worst things you could have parked your money in for the last several decades, particularly in relation to the stock market.
Now, there still might be one saving grace for the American economy, and that is its currency status as the world reserve. Now, this term is thrown around a lot, and people often use it in this debate to argue away the possibility that the US could end up like Venezuela, regardless of how much they let the money printer run.
Yet again, he acts as though only the United States is printing money, that Japan, the European Union, and China are not also printing money. This is either a deliberate omission or he really knows nothing about the subject and has no business making a video like this.
More often than not, people don't fully understand what it means. Back 70 years ago, it really did mean something. Before 1973, American dollars were backed by gold, and the US had by far away the largest gold reserves in the world. Today, it means something different. The US dollar is no longer backed by gold, and most global currencies are not pegged to the US dollar and are instead free-floating on the foreign exchange markets. Today, it simply means that the US dollar is the most widely held foreign currency by other nations.
Okay, he goes back to the gold standard, which ended 50 years ago, but other major currencies are also not tied to gold. Japan, the UK, the EU, and China do not have currencies tied to gold. Now, it would be quite bad if the United States lost its status as the world's reserve currency. That could cause a decline in the United States' standard of living by 10 to 20% rather quickly, but it would also flush out a lot of pernicious excesses that exist in the U.S. because the U.S. government believes that nothing it does ever has any real consequences. And if anything, that would be a necessary strengthening of U.S. society because a lot of pernicious excesses would go away. And then what? Some other country would become the world's reserve currency, and the only possible candidate is China. And since China would not be able to withstand all the same things that the United States has, in fact, withstood for this long, it would actually be very bad for China. This is not to say that being the world's reserve currency is a bad thing, but now he's conflating two separate issues into one. The notion that the U.S. could lose the world's reserve currency status could happen only because of bad government policies. As I often say, that's the one thing that could cause actual real problems and even inflation, but not Federal Reserve money printing.
The value of American money depends on the productive capacity of the planet, more so than the productive capacity of the states. This does genuinely give American dollars some resistance to depreciation, but it's not limitless, and it also doesn't protect the United States from a situation where the entire global economy is impacted, like, let's say, a global pandemic. Now, of course, this isn't necessarily a foregone conclusion, but the writing is on the wall.
The writing is on the wall? How so? The United States is not the only country doing money printing, as I say for the fifth time in this video. Yes, the United States is doing a certain amount of mismanagement that could make it lose world reserve currency status, and as I said a few minutes ago, that would cause an immediate reduction in the standard of living of Americans, but that may also flush out certain extremely bad behavior that the U.S. government engages in because it never faces the consequences of that behavior. So if anything, it could be a very healthy cleansing of a lot of other negative elements in U.S. society and U.S. governmental management. But I think we can stop over here. This video really shows how people with a formal economics background just cannot grasp what is occurring in the world economy. They have been taught that money printing causes inflation, and when it doesn't show up, they do everything from saying, well, the CPI is not measuring inflation correctly, or pretend that only the United States is printing money, when in fact all these other countries are also printing more money than the United States, and then conflate that into the worst thing of all, which is to say stock market gains comprise inflation, thereby eliminating any scenario under which wealth is created. And as I gave that example before, take that logic to its extreme. If anyone starts a company and the value of that company rises to billions of dollars and the person personally becomes a billionaire, under that paradigm, they would say that poor individual suffered more than his fair share of hyperinflation. What a terrible thing that is for that to happen to anyone. So when you get into these types of logical pretzels and denials because your paradigm is completely outdated, but you're unwilling to accept that the paradigm that you were rewarded for believing, because to graduate with an economics degree, you have to believe this, because only then will the professors accept your PhD dissertation as something contributing to what they believe the field of economics to be, then you can't let go of these false beliefs because you have spent years and years and years mouthing the same beliefs to others who also believe these things, and you create a complete ivory tower, a bubble that resides outside of all factual evidence. And that is why the economics profession is in fact the most out of touch profession relative to the changes in its own field, relative to anything else in the world today. And when that occurs, we're always on the brink of major historical turning points. I'll repeat, whenever a major field of study has an establishment that is entirely disconnected with technological changes in their field, technological changes that exist completely outside any set of scenarios that their outdated models can accommodate, we are at the brink of major historical turning points. One of the earlier times that this happened was very notable. All the establishment figures in mechanical engineering believed that heavier than air flying machines were not possible at all. They really believed that, and they believed that as late as 1901, and then two individuals outside of that establishment just went ahead and proved them wrong. And the same is happening over here. Now, there are other rebuttals to this Economics Explained hyperinflation video on YouTube, and you could watch those too, but they don't take into account the real reason, which is technological deflation and exponentially rising technology, and why technology is increasing as a proportion of the total economy. This Economics Explained video also pretends as though quantitative easing only started with the COVID-19 crisis in March 2020. It ignores the prior 11 years of money printing that have occurred beforehand. And as you can see from this chart over here, for which I do monthly updates, he is only talking about this money printing over here. What about all the many trillions of dollars, 20 trillion in fact, that occurred before the COVID-19 crisis? So he's only looking at this and completely ignoring this, which also did not cause inflation because inconvenient to his narrative. And while we're here, let's look at this particular point because this annoys me a fair bit. The U.S. Federal Reserve, the red line, is only this portion of world money printing, $8.3 trillion. European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and People's Bank of China are all doing similar amounts, and Europe is doing the most. So the United States is only 8.3 trillion out of 30 trillion, so about a fourth. And when you go down here and look at a percentage of GDP, total assets of major central banks as a percentage of local currency nominal GDP. The U.S. is the lowest of the four. The U.S. Federal Reserve, the red line, is the lowest of the four. The United States has done about 31% of its GDP in money printing in 11 years, and only a portion of that in the coronavirus timeframe. Look at how much Japan has done. Japan is 130% of its GDP in money printing. Does Japan have hyperinflation? I don't know a single person in the world that claims Japan has hyperinflation, but notice that the Economics Explained video went far out of its way to make sure it never mentions Japan at all. They went so far as to go back a century to Weimar Germany and then talk about North Korea, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela, but not modern Japan. And even the European Central Bank has done more than 60% of its GDP in terms of money printing, way more than the United States, way more. The European Central Bank, the same continent that the Weimar Republic once existed in. So even they are not afraid of money printing anymore. Only the economics profession and whoever they can dupe and sucker actually is. In our short video series, I'm going to have a brief follow-up to a video I posted a couple of weeks ago that you can find over here, where I debunk the Economics Explained channel's very high traffic video about how not only is hyperinflation going to happen, which some people think, he claims it is already happening, and all his rationales are very, very weak, and all sorts of statistical sleight of hand and misrepresentation of data and so forth. But he posted that video back in April, and since hyperinflation has not been showing up, he's been getting worried. So he posted a brief follow-up video, and the subject of his follow-up video is just doubling down, claiming that, well, there's types of hyperinflation that are already occurring that people don't notice. Now, I'll tell you right off the bat, if hyperinflation of anything significant is occurring, people will be unable to notice it for only a very short time. It will very quickly be noticed if it is anything of significance, and only products of significance should be tracked in terms of a basket of goods and the price of that basket of goods to assess whether there is hyperinflation. That's why I use that Goldman Sachs commodity index, because it's priced worldwide. But he continues to be very wrong, and even more wrong in some ways than his prior video. So we go to his new video, and as you can see, the title is How Price Inflation is Happening Without Anyone Realizing It. Ooh, it must be really high if nobody's realizing it. And I will do a point-by-point rebuttal of this video as well.
A lot of people, including myself, are very worried about inflation right now, particularly in the US. But what might be a more immediate problem is inflation's nasty little sidekick, shrinkflation. Companies...
Okay, right off the bat, I'll tell you, there's no way that a large economy like the United States can have inflation without all the economies that trade with the United States also having a similar amount of inflation. Inflation rates cannot be very different among countries that are similar per capita GDP and do a lot of trade with each other. So again, these economists with formal economist degrees are very theoretical creatures, and they just know so little about the real world. But now we get to the main crux of his video and how this shrinkflation concept is supposedly important enough to pay attention to.
Particularly those in the fast-moving consumer goods space will reduce the size of their products slowly but surely over time while maintaining the same price. A 10-pack of instant ramen for $2 becomes an 8-pack and then a 6-pack and then a 5-pack, all for the same $2. Now, companies don't actually make much more money by doing this because the cost to produce the final product in these markets tends to be very small. The difference between a 5-pack and a 10-pack of ramen will only be a few cents of manufacturing. But what it does allow the company to do is reintroduce that same 10-pack of ramen a few months later, slap a family-size sticker on it, and call the new $3 price tag a bargain without anybody noticing it's not really $1 off, it's 50% more than what we were paying just a few months ago.
Okay, where to begin? First of all, shrinkflation has occurred in anecdotal instances. We've all seen a 16-ounce pack of something be the same price for 14 ounces, but that's a one-time thing. They just can't do it again and again and again forever, because eventually people figure that out and it becomes very obvious. And why would this only be happening now? Sure, some types of products have gone from 16-ounce to 14-ounce sizes, but that is nothing new. It is not an ongoing trend of runaway inflation, and it's really no different than a product selling for $9.99 instead of $10 to psychologically make people think that something that is $10 is actually somewhat less than $10. That's nothing new, and unless it is continuous change, it does not comprise annual inflation. Now, the second point, even going a little bit outside of economics, he thinks all food is just processed food. Why would anyone only eat processed food like that? I can tell you for a fact that all real food, such as fresh produce, fruits and vegetables, and legumes, have not risen in price at all over the last 20 years. If you go actually buy individual tomatoes, carrots, celery bunches, and so forth, all of those are about the same price as 20 years ago. So the fact that he thinks processed food, and worst of all, ramen, is food, if a large part of your expenditures are ramen, even a large part of your food expenditures are ramen noodles, one of the most processed foods around with one of the worst glycemic indices you could possibly find. You have much bigger problems than the esoteric subject of inflation as viewed from a hyper-theoretical economist. This is crazy. Note that not even a single picture in his ridiculous video was of actual whole vegetables and fruits. That's crazy. He says, there's hyperinflation of food. Look at ramen. Ramen equals food. And not even once does he mention normal fruits and vegetables, or beans, or lentils, or something, that might be healthy, something that people 100 years ago might have recognized as food. Now, this is not a health channel, but the type of examples he chose are so incredibly ridiculous that I just have to skewer this video for saying the price of ramen noodles is rising because they're putting fewer packs in a crate, and therefore you're experiencing hyperinflation and your prosperity is going down. Foods that are that processed are like cigarettes. They're a tax on people who know nothing about health and have no self-control. If a large portion of your diet is processed food, you have bigger problems than worrying about the finer points of economics. I repeat again that the actual price of real fruits and vegetables, the type that you would buy in their whole form, the type that you might actually cut with a knife, and if a vegetable, you might cook it in order to prepare it to eat, that has not risen at all. And to prove that, let me show you an important chart. This is a chart from The Economist. Even though it ends in 2010, it is relevant over here. These are the productivity gains of various industries. And construction, of course, is the one that has had no productivity gains since 1947. I have different videos on this channel about that. But look over here. Agriculture, the subject we're talking about right now, has had 1,600% gains from 1947 to 2010, and probably even more from 2010 to 2021 in the United States. Agriculture has become so productive. That's why fruits and vegetables in non-marked up supermarkets, don't go to some ultra high price, super curated marked up supermarket. Go to some very basic supermarket, preferably an ethnic one where the fruits and vegetables are not super organized and only the best ones are presented because they threw out the other 9 out of 10. And you'll see the prices are ridiculously low. It's hard to rack up a bill of more than $4 or $5 in buying these fruits and vegetables, as long as you're buying them as proper produce, not all this canned and processed junk that we saw in that Economics Explained video. So not only is he doubling down on his hyperinflation narrative, but he's presuming that everyone's entire diet is processed food, and worst of all, things like ramen noodles. I mean, how can you take such a person seriously, and why would you listen to anything that he has to say? Agriculture productivity has been so high due to technological progress that the price of basic fruits and vegetables has not risen in my adult lifetime at all. And I can say that with complete certainty. It has become so inexpensive that this myth of food inflation is just completely out of the question. It's more a myth of processed food inflation. Processed food is not really food. It is merely a food-like concoction that was made in a factory. And people should know that difference. And like I said, processed food rising in price is just like cigarettes rising in price. It has about the same economic impact. It's a tax on lower information people with lower self-control. So I don't want this video to be too long, but I wanted to debunk the Economics Explained channel's latest doubling down on the narrative of high inflation and how the examples he is choosing are getting weaker and weaker and weaker. I look forward to what he comes up with next because he's not going to abandon this hyperinflation narrative, that's for sure. Thank you for watching.